Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So this is a video to, in a concise way, explain the main types of hand weapons or side weapons that were used in Afghanistan up until the early 20th century. Predominantly the examples I'm going to show here are 19th century, in fact they're all 19th century, and there were many weapons in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a region which had lots of influence from Persia and the Arabic countries, so Persian culture and Arabic culture on one side, and Indian culture on the other, and to a certain degree Nepalese culture as well. And for that reason, the weapons that you find in Afghanistan for the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries are largely influenced by Islamic culture from their west and south, and from Indian culture from their south and east. And just to mention that Afghanistan as we know it now did and still does contain many different cultural and tribal groupings. So we might generically talk about Afghans, but actually if you look at 19th century history and 19th century descriptions of that region, in actual fact Afghanistan itself, not all of the people are or were Afghans, okay? Many of them in fact that the British and Indian armies encountered were in fact Pathans, for example, spelt Pathan, but pronounced usually in India Patan, I believe. And in fact the Pathans were often used as soldiers. They were often employed as soldiers, both as mercenaries by various people, but in the British Army as well, often as irregulars. So if, for example, we look at a unit like the Corps of Guides, which was essentially an irregular branch of cavalry and infantry who were raised to essentially police and manage and collect taxes in that kind of northwest frontier region and the Punjab as well. A lot of them were Pathans. Additionally, another prominent group was the Baluch or Baluchis, who were famous for having certain types of hairdo, essentially, quite fancy haircuts. So it's a very, very interesting region. But the weapons tend to be quite universal across Afghanistan, and as I mentioned, you do find Arabic and Persian weapons coming into Afghanistan, you do find Indian weapons coming into Afghanistan as well. However, in terms of swords and knives, you can essentially break down the predominant weapons in Afghanistan into three objects. Number one is what would be worn usually in the sash or cummerbund, which is known as a pesh kabs. That is Peshkabz. There we go, pesh kabs. Obviously that's a British and English way of rendering the word that originally would have been written in various languages and dialects, but it's pronounced pesh kabs, I believe. And now these are very similar in function actually to a European medieval rondel dagger. They usually have a T-section blade. That is, if I was to saw through the blade here, you've essentially got a flat portion which has an edge on this side, and then a back which is like a T here, okay? And they are sharp-edged up one side, pretty much never sharp-edged on the back, because of course you've got that T-section. They don't have any kind of false edge, but what you end up with is an incredibly pointy, and I have never sharpened this, but it is literally like a needle, and this is an original 19th century one, thrusting point. Yes, you could kind of slash, you could kind of draw cut, push cut, pull cut. You can't hack with this at all. It's not the right type of width or cross-sectional balance. It is really a thrusting knife, and whilst it could be used this way round, I suspect very strongly they were predominantly used this way around, much like a rondel dagger. And you'll notice they usually have this characteristic, try not to stab myself with it, characteristic large flat pommel section there. And you'll notice when you hold it in the point down in the ice pick grip, your thumb very naturally fits comfortably on top of that. This is undoubtedly somehow related to yataghan grips. Okay, if you look at yataghan grips, they are made constructed in almost exactly the same way and have a very similar form. Certainly Turkish Ottoman yataghan grips of the 17th, 18th century tend to have these bits are more flared, and in actual fact with those it even feels even more comfortable to put your thumb in there. But either way, this is obviously a close range stabbing implement, usually worn there, much like a rundle dagger. It's very quick to access and bam, ice pick grip. And it's important to note as well that the cross section of the blade was almost certainly partly designed that way to aid penetration of not necessarily always armour, but things that are quite resistive. In Afghanistan it was quite common to wear what the British called a poshteen, which I believe is an anglicisation of the native word. And a poshteen is essentially a thick sheepskin turned inside out, so the leather's on the outside, the wool is on the inside. Very warm of course, but also quite protective, famously so quite protective against to a degree thrusts, but even more so cuts. And of course Afghans usually had some type of turban wrapped around their head and lots of other clothes because Afghanistan gets really cold. And of the kind of the nobility and the kind of the knightly classes, for want of a better word, did often wear mail and mixed mail and plate armour as well. So this type of rondel dagger type thrusting dagger for penetrating really resistive things is an important thing to have, for the same reason that rondel daggers were important in medieval Europe. So there we go, that's the shortest of the three weapons that we're going to look at, the pesh cabs. Next up was the very common, and it's essentially the common person's sword. Now this is known as the Torah or Chada. It was pronounced differently in different parts of India, and it's rendered in English in different ways, because obviously in 19th century India and Afghanistan, British people came along and they heard the word. Some people said chara, some people said chora. I think the chora is probably more the Indian pronunciation, and they just wrote it down in English how they thought it should be spelt. So when we get into arguments about how we should spell it in English, that's really silly, because all it is it's a phonetic rendition of how the word sounded like in different regions. Anyway, the chara or chora is essentially it's somewhat like a peasant knife or a messer from medieval Renaissance Europe. It's single-edged and it has the same T-section blade as the pesh cabs. In many ways it's like a scaled up pesh cabs, and you'll notice that the hilts have the same form of construction. That is, two plates either side of where the guard is, what forms the guard, and the guard is simply a cutout. There's nothing projecting beyond the width of the blade itself. And then there are two, usually horn, sometimes wood, sometimes ivory, sometimes other things, sometimes metal, but usually horn plates riveted either side of the tang. Okay, and this is predominantly a cutting weapon. I've talked about this in previous videos. Although it's pointy and looks like it would be a very good thrusting weapon, accounts of the time make it clear that these were predominantly used like machetes or barongs or parangs. Okay, so this is a cutting slashing weapon, and they could be used by themselves, and often were, especially if, remember, these are not primary weapons, these are backup sidearms. The primary weapons would usually be a gun, a jezail or some form of matchlock or musket, or in earlier times a bow. Okay, but so these are the side weapons. So these could be used by themselves and might just be worn by themselves, and sometimes a person would wear one of these and one of these, and or they could be used with a shield, okay, which in India would be called a dal. I don't know what the Afghan word is for it, but usually those are circular and leather and domed. Okay, and so you could be using this with a shield as well. So that this so-called, incidentally I should mention, this is the Khyber knife. Okay, what's predominantly referred to as a Khyber knife is the Torah or Chada. Very occasionally it becomes evident from period sources that when British sources, for example, refer to a Khyber knife, they actually mean the dagger. But usually the feared Khyber knife was this, and it was famous for dealing out very severe cuts and slashes, just like a machete or a barong would. Okay, so there we go, that's the Khyber knife or Torah or Chada. This is probably the most common sidearm in Afghanistan in the 18th, 19th centuries. And to finish off is the polwar. Now, I might do a video just about this in the future, but the polwar is essentially, if you were a more well-to-do Afghan, if you had a bit more money, then instead of having a Torah or Khyber knife, you would spend a bit more money, probably, I don't actually know, but I'm guessing maybe 3 or 4 times as much money, and buy one of these. Now, polwar is just the Afghan rendering of tulwar, and all it means is sword. Okay, so this is a sword, and fundamentally this was influenced very heavily by the Indian tulwar, and you can see from the design of it, you know, superficially it does look like an Indian tulwar. And here I have an Indian tulwar to compare. You can see that they are similar types of sword, and for the most part the blades between Afghan tulwars and Indian tulwars are pretty much identical. They follow the same general size and shape and characteristics. Some of them were imported European blades, mostly German made, occasionally British but usually German, very occasionally French, but as I say, usually German. Or indeed they were native made, either Afghan made or Indian made locally. And what you'll find with the Afghan blades is because swords were, I think, harder to come by in Afghanistan. I think Afghans on average were probably poorer people in the 19th century than Indians were. So tulwars in India were very, very common. Pretty much everyone had a tulwar, it seems, or every man of kind of free status had a tulwar. Whereas in Afghanistan it seems that tulwars were much rarer and really only the well-to-do could afford them. And for that reason, sometimes you find, or perhaps proportionately more often you'll find with Afghan tulwars, the blades are so-called watered or damask or Wootz steel. And in actual fact, this example I'm holding, I haven't etched it yet, but it has patterns in the steel, and I do intend to polish this and etch it because I suspect very strongly that this is a Wootz blade. Main characteristics to note about the tulwar, but to stand a bit closer so hopefully it's sort of in focus for you, are these droopy quillons which always have almost what looks like a tulip head at the end of each. I don't know what those signify. I don't know whether they're beasts or floral or whatever, but they pretty much, tulwars pretty much always have these drooped down quillons and these little tulip type things, and those tulip type things are hollow in the end. You can stick your finger in the end. So they must signify something. If anybody out there knows, please tell me. Then also you pretty much always have this bulged centre section of the grip which fits into your hand quite nicely, and it's a short confining grip as you'd find on a Viking era sword, or indeed of course on the tulwar. And the pommels are quite different to tulwars. So whereas tulwars are usually a flat or slightly curved disc, the tulwar is essentially a semicircle, so it's like a ball that's been chopped in half. And they are, as far as I've seen, always hollow. Okay, so this is half of a sphere, in other words a hemisphere, it's completely hollow inside. It's a forged sheet that's been made into like a cup and then had a disc at the top, and that disc just sits in the cup and then is held in place by obviously the tang nut. The tang goes all the way through to here and is secured at the end. And I have heard, and I can't verify this, but some of these when you shake them, and in fact this one's true, you can hear something jangling around in there, and I understand that there's some kind of symbolic significance to what's put inside there. They are specifically made to be hollow so that they can contain something, that it has religious or symbolic significance, but I don't want to talk too much about that because I don't know the details of it. Okay, so there we go, the three primary bladed sidearms of Afghanistan. And I should finally mention that Indian tulwars, of course, were traded into the region as well, and so you do find Indian tulwars in Afghanistan as well. So there we go, the sword, the big knife, and then the small dagger. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.